My mom called me a slut for getting pregnant by mistake. Then the same thing happened to her. My mom never let me forget that I ruined my life by having my son Hudson when I was 16. She'd wake me up for school by saying good morning to the slut who couldn't keep her legs closed and destroyed her whole future for 5 minutes of fun. Every day she reminded me that I was an embarrassment to our family and she was ashamed to show her face at church. Teen moms are just sluts who got caught. She'd tell her friends on the phone loud enough for me to hear from my room. When Hudson cried at night, she'd bang on my door screaming that this was my punishment and I better not wake her up with my mistakes. At family dinners, she'd announce that I was lucky she didn't throw me out on the street like I deserved. I worked nights at the grocery store and went to school during the day, while Hudson stayed at daycare that took most of my paycheck. Mom charged me rent for my childhood bedroom and made me buy all my own food and diapers, even though she made good money as a nurse. She told everyone at church that she was a saint for letting her slut daughter live at home instead of making me homeless like other parents would. When I got straight A's, she said it didn't matter because teen moms don't go to college, and I'd be working minimum wage forever. "You're damaged goods now, and no decent man will ever want you," she said, every time she saw me doing homework at the kitchen table. I applied for scholarships behind her back and got a full ride to the state college for next year. Hudson was thriving at daycare and hitting all his milestones early, even though Mom said children of teens always turn out stupid. I saved every penny I could and planned to move into student housing with Hudson as soon as I graduated. Mom had no idea I was leaving because she was too busy going to wine nights. She'd been going out more and more lately and coming home drunk at 3 in the morning smelling like cologne. But then Mom missed her period and I heard her throwing up every morning for a week. She took 5 pregnancy tests in the bathroom and I heard her sobbing when they all came back positive. The real shock came at her first ultrasound when she found out it was triplets from some guy she met at a bar whose name she didn't even remember. She was 43 years old and suddenly pregnant with 3 babies from a one-night stand while drunk. "This can't be happening to me," she kept crying while I fed Hudson his breakfast. Her church friends completely abandoned her when they found out she was pregnant without a husband or even a boyfriend. They called her the same names she'd called me for 3 years, like war and slut and embarrassment. Her job put her on unpaid leave because she was too sick from the pregnancy to work, and she couldn't afford the mortgage without my rent money. She had to sell her nice car for a used minivan that could fit 3 car seats. The pregnancy was high risk because of her age and the triplets, so she was on bed rest by month 5. Mom suddenly wanted me around all the time to bring her food and clean the house and help her to the bathroom. She cried about how her life was over and she'd never find a husband now with 3 babies and no money. "At least you only had 1 baby to ruin your life, but I have 3, she sobbed, like I should feel sorry for her. The church kicked her out of the women's ministry for getting pregnant outside of marriage, and she had nobody left because she'd spent years judging everyone else. She begged me to skip school to take her to doctor appointments and got mad when I said I couldn't miss class. The triplets came early and spent weeks in the NICU, costing more than Mom would make in 5 years. She couldn't work with 3 newborns, and daycare would cost $4,000 a month. Mom had to apply for food stamps and welfare, just like she'd shamed other single moms for doing. She couldn't handle all 3 babies crying at once and would scream for me to help while I was trying to study for finals. "You know what it's like being a young mom, so you need to help me," she said, like we were suddenly the same. I showed her my college acceptance letter and told her Hudson and I were moving out after graduation. Mom's face went white, and she started shaking while holding one of the crying triplets. "You can't leave me alone with 3 babies when you know what this is like," she screamed. I reminded her that she never helped me once with Hudson and called me a names every day for 3 years. "I've already paid the deposit on our apartment and Hudson's enrolled in the campus daycare," I told her while packing our stuff. She blocked my bedroom door, holding all 3 screaming babies who were red-faced and desperate. "If you leave, I'll die trying to take care of these babies alone, and it'll be your fault for abandoning your family." I looked at the triplets who didn't ask to be born into this mess and felt my stomach twist. My mom didn't deserve anything from me, but how was I supposed to choose myself over 3 innocent babies? The weight of those 3 tiny bodies pressed against my chest as I stood there frozen in my doorway. Hudson's small fingers dug into my leg as he whimpered at all the noise and chaos around us. My packed bags sat visible behind me on the bed, while Mom's body blocked the only exit from my room. The triplets screamed in her arms with their faces turning red and their tiny fists waving in the air. I couldn't move or speak or even breathe properly as I stared at those innocent babies who never asked for any of this. Hudson started crying too, and pulling at my jeans trying to get me to pick him up and make everything better. Mom's eyes were wild and desperate as she shifted the babies in her arms to keep them from slipping. One of them spit up formula all over her shirt, but she didn't even notice. I finally found my voice and told her I needed time to think about everything. She started to argue, but I pushed past her carefully and took Hudson's hand to lead him to the kitchen. My hands shook as I got the peanut butter from the cabinet and tried to spread it on bread for his lunch. The knife kept slipping because my fingers wouldn't work right. Hudson sat at his little plastic table watching me with big, worried eyes. I could hear the babies still crying from the living room where Mom had followed us. She was trying to bounce all three at once, but it wasn't working. I gave Hudson his sandwich and some apple slices, then pulled out my phone to call the campus daycare. The woman who answered sounded so cheerful and normal, like everything in the world was fine. She confirmed Hudson's spot would start next week and reminded me they needed his shot records by Monday. I wrote it down on the back of an envelope with a shaking hand while Hudson ate his lunch quietly. Mom came into the kitchen holding two babies, while the third screamed from a bouncer on the floor. She asked what I was doing, and I told her I was confirming Hudson's daycare for college. Her face crumpled, and she started crying again, which made the babies cry harder. That night was pure hell, as the triplets took turns screaming every hour. I could hear Mom stumbling between their bassinets trying to figure out which one needed what. At 3 in the morning, she was sobbing that she couldn't do this alone, and she was going to lose her mind. I covered Hudson's ears as he tossed and turned in his toddler bed next to mine. He'd already woken up twice asking why the babies wouldn't stop crying. I didn't sleep at all, and when my alarm went off at 6, I felt like I'd been hit by a truck. I stumbled to the living room and found Mom passed out on the couch with one baby on her chest, barely breathing. The other two were in the bassinet crying with dirty diapers. I picked them up one at a time and changed them on the floor, then made 3 bottles with the last of the formula. Mom didn't even wake up when I put the baby from her chest back in the bassinet. I shook her shoulder gently and told her I had to leave for work soon. She opened her eyes and looked confused about where she was. I left her sitting up trying to feed one baby while the other 2 fussed. Work was a nightmare because I could barely keep my eyes open. My manager pulled me aside during my break and asked if everything was okay at home. I lied and said yes, even though I probably looked like death. She frowned and said she was worried about me, but also couldn't have me making mistakes on the register. She reminded me I'd already had 2 warnings about being late and distracted. One more, and she'd have to let me go even though she liked me. I nodded and promised to do better, but we both knew it was getting worse, not better. When I got home that afternoon, the house looked like a bomb went off. There were dirty diapers on the coffee table and formula spilled on the carpet. Empty bottles were everywhere, and the sink was full of dishes. Mom had managed to feed all 3 babies, but nothing else. She was sitting on the floor in her pajamas from yesterday, holding one baby, while the other 2 lay on blankets. She looked up when I walked in, and immediately started begging me to skip school tomorrow. She needed help with the laundry because the babies were out of clean clothes. The dishes were piling up, and she hadn't eaten anything except crackers all day. I told her I couldn't miss school because finals were next week. My scholarship depended on keeping perfect grades, and I couldn't risk losing it. She called me selfish and heartless for abandoning her when she needed me most. She said the babies could die if she fell asleep and didn't hear them choking or crying. I reminded her she never helped me once when Hudson was a baby, and I figured it out. She screamed that was different because I only had 1 baby, and she had 3. Hudson had been getting worse every day since the triplets came home. His daycare teacher pulled me aside at pickup and said he'd been having accidents again after being potty trained for a year. He was clingy and kept asking other kids if babies were going to take their mommies away. He'd started having nightmares every night and waking up screaming about monsters. Last night, he wet the bed for the 3rd time this week. I had to wash his sheets in the bathtub because Mom was using the washer for baby clothes. The next day, I took Hudson to the park just to get him away from all the crying and chaos. He ran around on the playground like his normal, happy self for the first time in days. Our neighbor was there with her grandson and came over to talk to me. She mentioned she was worried about all the crying coming from our house at all hours. She asked if Mom was handling the triplets okay and if we needed any help. The way she said it made my stomach drop because I could tell she was thinking about calling someone to check on us. I packed Hudson into his car seat, trying not to think about what the neighbor might do while we drove home. The next morning, my phone buzzed during my chemistry final review session, and I saw Mom's name flash across the screen with 5 missed calls already. I ignored it and tried to focus on the professor explaining oxidation reactions, but the phone kept vibrating in my pocket. Finally, I stepped into the hallway and read her texts about one of the triplets screaming for 3 hours straight and maybe having a fever. She couldn't drive all 3 babies to the doctor because she still couldn't get the car seats installed right in the minivan. I looked back at the classroom where everyone was taking notes on material that would definitely be on the final exam worth 30% of my grade. My stomach twisted as I grabbed my backpack and left, knowing I'd have to figure out the chemistry on my own somehow. I drove home to find Mom in yesterday's milk-stained shirt, holding the screaming baby, while the other two cried in their bassinets. We loaded all three babies into my old Honda, which took 20 minutes of adjusting straps and buckles, then drove to the pediatrician's office, where we waited another hour in the packed waiting room. The doctor checked the baby and said it was reflux, which meant special formula that cost $48 for a small can instead of the $20 regular kind. Mom started crying right there in the exam room about how she couldn't afford it, and the nurse quietly slipped us a bag of sample cans while explaining how to apply for WIC benefits. We drove home in silence except for the babies fussing, and I helped carry them all back inside before rushing to my shift at the grocery store. That night I got home at 11 and still had to write my English paper that was due by midnight, but Mom needed help with the 2 a.m. feeding. I set up my laptop on the kitchen counter and typed while warming bottles, then fed one triplet while Mom handled the other two. My eyes burned and my head pounded as I wrote about symbolism in The Great Gatsby, knowing the paper was garbage, but at least it would be submitted on time. I finally clicked submit at 11:58 p.m. and collapsed into bed only to wake up 3 hours later when the babies started their next feeding cycle. 2 days later, I was doing homework at the kitchen table when someone knocked on the door. Mom answered it holding one of the triplets, and I heard a woman's voice I recognized from church saying she'd brought a casserole. She came into the kitchen and set down a small dish while looking around at the formula cans and dirty bottles everywhere. She started talking about how God punishes sin and how Mom needed to repent for her choices and accept the consequences of her actions. Mom just stood there taking it, while tears rolled down her face, and after the woman left, Mom threw the casserole in the trash and locked herself in the bathroom to sob. I wanted to be mad at her for how she'd treated me the exact same way, but seeing her broken like that made something twist in my chest. My phone rang the next afternoon during my lunch break, and the caller ID showed the campus housing office. The coordinator explained they needed Hudson's custody documents and updated vaccination records by Friday, or we'd lose our spot in student housing. I searched through my files and realized his custody papers from when his dad signed away rights were missing, probably lost when Mom went through my room looking for things to sell for formula money. I called the courthouse, and they said I could get copies, but I'd need to come in person with proper ID and pay a $15 processing fee. Mom started texting me frantically about being out of milk and bread and begging me to stop at the store. I looked at my wallet with exactly $20 until my next paycheck in 3 days and knew I had to choose between gas to get to the courthouse, the document fee, or formula for the triplets. I put $10 of gas in my car and drove to the courthouse where I spent an hour waiting in line, and then another hour for them to find and copy the papers. While I sat there, Mom kept texting about the babies crying and needing groceries and asking when I'd be home to help. I finally got the documents and had just enough gas to make it home, where Mom was trying to make bottles with the last of the formula powder. That evening I was heating up leftover rice for Hudson's dinner when I saw a car pull up outside that made my whole body go cold. It was a white sedan with the state seal on the door and official plates, the kind of car that meant someone had finally made the call I'd been dreading. The woman who got out wore a blazer and carried a clipboard, and she walked up our driveway with the kind of purpose that meant this wasn't a casual visit. Mom was in the living room with all three babies crying at once when the doorbell rang, and I watched her face go white when she saw who it was through the window. The woman introduced herself as Cheyenne Carlson from Child Protective Services, saying they'd received a concern about infant welfare and needed to do a wellness check. She came inside and looked around at the chaos, taking notes on her clipboard about the dirty bottles, the overflowing diaper pail, and the general disaster, while Mom tried to explain she was doing her best with 3 newborns. Cheyenne asked to see where the babies slept and checked their bassinets, then looked in the fridge and cupboards while writing more notes. She interviewed Mom first, asking about support systems and daily routines, and whether she felt capable of managing 3 infants. Then she called me into the kitchen privately and asked about my role in caring for the triplets and how much school I'd been missing to help. She wanted to know if I felt pressured to take on parenting responsibilities and whether I thought the babies were safe. After an hour of questions and inspection, Cheyenne sat us both down and explained she wasn't removing anyone today, but she had serious concerns. She created a safety plan that required Mom to attend parenting classes and therapy, plus weekly check-ins for the next month. Then she looked directly at me and said something that made my stomach drop. She explained that if I took on too much responsibility for the triplets, if I became their primary caregiver while Mom couldn't cope, I could legally become responsible for them. The court could decide I was their guardian if Mom was found unfit and I was already providing their care. The weight of those words hit me hard as I realized how careful I had to be about helping without becoming trapped. Mom had to start parenting classes the next week, going every Tuesday evening to learn about safe sleep and feeding schedules. She came home with handouts and worksheets, actually reading them at the kitchen table and trying to follow the routines they suggested. The next morning, I told Mom I'd help with the babies on Tuesday and Thursday nights until graduation, but that was it. She started crying and saying I was selfish, but I held firm and reminded her she never helped me once with Hudson when I was 16 and scared. She kept arguing until Cheyenne showed up for her weekly check-in and backed me up, telling Mom that healthy boundaries were important for both of us. Mom finally stopped fighting about it when Cheyenne wrote in her notes that I was being reasonable and Mom needed to respect my schedule. 2 days later, my phone rang while I was at work, and I saw a number I didn't recognize. The man on the other end said he was Sean Henderson, Mom's old pastor from before she got kicked out, and he'd heard about her situation from another church member. He said he wanted to help without judgment, and had already gotten 3 families to agree to bring meals twice a week. I gave him our address and thanked him, even though Mom would probably hate getting help from people who knew her shame. That Sunday, the first meal showed up in a cooler on our porch with no note, just containers of lasagna and salad and bread that would feed us for days. Mom cried when she saw it, but ate 2 helpings anyway because she was so tired of cereal and whatever I could throw together. The following week, Mom had the triplets' 2-month checkup scheduled for 9 in the morning, and I was supposed to be at work by 10. She loaded all 3 babies into her minivan, but it wouldn't start, just made a clicking sound when she turned the key. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. I had to call my manager and say I'd be late, then drive Mom and 1 baby at a time to the doctor since my car only had room for Hudson's car seat. The first trip took 20 minutes each way. Then I had to go back for the second baby, while Mom waited in the lobby with the first one. By the time I got all 3 babies there and helped with the appointment and drove everyone home in shifts, it was past 1 o'clock. My manager pulled me into her office the second I clocked in and wrote me up for missing half my shift without proper notice. She said 1 more absence or tardy would mean termination, and she didn't care what my excuse was because the store needed reliable workers. I needed this job to pay the deposit for student housing, so I just nodded and apologized and went to stock shelves with shaking hands. That evening, Cheyenne came by for another check-in and noticed Mom had been crying about the car situation. She sat down with her notebook and started asking Mom about the father of the babies, saying child support could help with expenses. Mom turned red and admitted she'd been blackout drunk at a bar called Murphy's and only remembered the guy had dark hair and bought her shots. Cheyenne helped her think through details like what night it was and whether she'd paid with a card that would show the date. Mom found the receipt in her purse from that night in January, and Cheyenne said that was enough to start looking into it. A few days later, I had to go to freshman orientation at the college for student parents, which meant bringing Hudson along since Mom had the triplets. In the meeting room, I sat next to a girl named Yasmin, who had a toddler on her lap too. She told me about resources I had no idea existed, like emergency childcare swaps, where parents watched each other's kids during exams. She showed me a Facebook group where student parents traded babysitting hours and shared information about family-friendly study spots on campus. Yasmin said the first year was hard, but the support network made it possible, and she gave me her number in case I needed anything. 3 weeks later, Mom finally got the letter saying she was approved for WIC and food stamps after filling out stacks of paperwork and waiting forever. We went to the grocery store together with all 3 babies and Hudson, and when the benefits card worked at checkout, Mom started crying right there in line. I remembered being in that exact spot 3 years ago when I first got approved, buying formula for Hudson with my own benefits card while people stared. Now Mom was the one people were judging as she loaded formula and baby food into the minivan that still wasn't fixed. The next Monday, Hudson's daycare director called me out of class to say he'd been hitting other kids and throwing toys during circle time. She asked if anything had changed at home, and I had to explain about the triplets and the chaos and how we were moving soon. The director said Hudson needed consistency, and if the behavior continued, they might have to suspend him, which would mean I'd miss school to watch him. I picked him up early that day, and he clung to me crying, asking why the babies were so loud and when we were going to our new house. That night after Hudson was asleep, I got on Facebook and started searching through Mom's friends list for anyone who might have been at Murphy's bar in January. I found the receipt had a timestamp of 11:47 p.m. on January 15th, so I looked for guys who'd posted about being out that night. After 2 hours of searching, I found Conrad Goodman, who'd checked in at Murphy's that exact night and had dark hair like Mom remembered. I sent him a message saying we needed to talk about something important from January, and he read it, but didn't respond for 3 days. When he finally wrote back, He said he was married and didn't know what I was talking about, but I mentioned paternity testing and child support laws, and suddenly he agreed to meet. Conrad showed up at a coffee shop looking scared and sweating through his shirt. He admitted he remembered my mom from that night, but said it was a mistake and his wife couldn't find out. I showed him pictures of the triplets and told him they needed financial support, and he agreed to a DNA test if we kept it quiet. 2 weeks later, one of the triplets started coughing and wouldn't stop, and his breathing sounded wet and raspy. Mom rushed him to the emergency room where they said he had RSV and needed to be admitted for oxygen support. She called me sobbing from the hospital saying she couldn't leave him alone, but the other 2 babies were with the neighbor who could only watch them for a few hours. I had my government final the next morning but packed a bag with clothes for Mom and food since the hospital cafeteria was expensive. Hudson and I drove to the hospital where the baby was hooked up to monitors and oxygen tubes, looking so small in the huge hospital bed. Mom hadn't showered in 2 days and looked ready to collapse, so I told her to go home and check on the other 2 while I stayed with the sick baby. She cried the whole way out, but I knew she needed to take care of the others and get some rest, or she'd end up sick too. I spent the night in the uncomfortable hospital chair holding the baby when he cried and watching his oxygen levels on the monitor while studying my government notes. The nurse came in every hour to check his breathing and give him treatments, and I dozed between visits while worrying about my final. The next morning, the baby was stable but still needed oxygen, and Mom came back with the other 2 triplets because the neighbor couldn't watch them anymore. I had to leave for my final with 40 minutes to get to campus, and Mom begged me to stay, but I knew this grade determined whether I kept my scholarship. I made it to class with 2 minutes to spare, took the test on no sleep, and drove straight back to the hospital where the baby was finally breathing better. The doctor said the baby could go home in the morning, but someone had to be there for discharge instructions at 8:30 sharp, the exact time my government final started across town. Mom begged me to skip the test and pick up the baby while she stayed home with the other 2, but I grabbed my backpack and told her she'd have to figure it out herself since this grade determined my whole scholarship. She screamed that I was heartless as I walked out of the hospital, but I drove straight to campus and sat down for the final with my hands still shaking from exhaustion. The test covered everything from the Constitution to current Supreme Court cases, and I forced myself to focus on each question while trying not to think about Mom struggling to get all 3 babies ready alone. I turned in my paper after 90 minutes and checked my phone to find 20 missed calls from Mom and a text saying she'd managed to get a ride from the neighbor but would never forgive me for choosing school over family. 3 days later, Conrad called to say the DNA test results were in, and yes, he was definitely the father of all 3 triplets. His voice cracked when he told me his wife had found the test paperwork in his car and was filing for divorce, taking their 2 kids and most of his savings. He agreed to pay $300 a month starting in 2 months to avoid going to court, where everything would become public record, and hurt his job as a bank manager. Mom cried when I told her the amount since formula alone cost more than that, but at least it was something coming in eventually. The next week, Cheyenne showed up for her scheduled home visit and walked through the house taking notes on her clipboard. She checked the fridge, which now had formula and baby food, looked at the organized changing station Mom had set up in the living room, and watched Mom handle all 3 babies during a feeding without completely losing it. Cheyenne said she was seeing real improvement and would reduce visits to once a month instead of weekly, though the safety plan would stay active for 6 more months. After she left, Mom actually smiled for the first time in weeks and said maybe she could do this after all. My grades posted online the following Monday, and I held my breath logging into the portal. Government final A-, English A, Biology A, Statistics A-, and somehow World History A+, despite turning in that paper on 2 hours of sleep. My GPA stayed at 3.9, which meant the scholarship was safe, and I could officially confirm my spot in student housing for fall. I called the financial aid office right away, and the woman said she'd email the final paperwork for Hudson's daycare coverage, which would save me $800 a month. Mom's doctor finally convinced her to try antidepressants after she broke down crying during a checkup about the triplets. She started taking them every morning, and after 2 weeks I noticed she wasn't texting me every 5 minutes during class, with emergencies that weren't really emergencies. She also started going to therapy every Thursday, while the church nursery watched the babies for free as part of their outreach program. Sean had called around to different churches after ours turned their backs on Mom, and he found one that actually wanted to help instead of judge. He organized a meal train through their website and got 5 families to sign up for bringing dinner once a week. It wasn't a ton of help, but it meant Mom could focus on the babies instead of cooking, and the lasagnas and casseroles were way better than the frozen pizzas she'd been living on. I took Hudson to see our new apartment on campus on a Saturday morning when Mom had a therapy appointment. The student housing complex had a playground and a community garden, and our unit had 2 small bedrooms with fresh paint and working heat that didn't rattle like our current house. Hudson ran straight to the smaller bedroom and started planning where his toys would go, asking if he could have a dinosaur poster on the wall. Seeing him excited instead of stressed made my chest feel lighter for the first time in months. That Sunday, while I was giving the triplets their bottles so Mom could shower, she came out with wet hair and sat next to me on the couch. She said she knew she'd been cruel to me for 3 years and understood why I needed to leave, that she'd probably leave too if she could. It wasn't a real apology with the words, "I'm sorry," but hearing her admit she'd been cruel felt like more than I'd ever expected to get. The triplets had started sleeping 4 hours at a time instead of waking up every 90 minutes, which meant Mom could actually get enough rest to function like a human being. She found an online support group for parents of multiples and spent nap time reading posts about feeding schedules and sleep training that actually worked. One mom from California sent her a spreadsheet for tracking everything that helped her stay organized instead of just reacting to whoever cried loudest. My last shift at the grocery store finally arrived 2 weeks before graduation. I'd given my notice a month earlier and trained my replacement, a high school kid who needed the job as badly as I had 3 years ago. My manager pulled me aside at the end of my shift and handed me an envelope with $500 cash inside, saying it was a bonus for never calling out sick, despite everything I'd been dealing with at home. That money would cover Hudson's registration at the new daycare, plus his first month of after-school care, which meant one less thing to worry about when we moved. 2 days before graduation, Conrad's first child support check showed up in Mom's mailbox for $300, which wasn't much, but covered formula for the whole month. Mom opened the envelope with shaking hands and immediately drove to the store to buy the special reflux formula the triplets needed, while I watched them squirm in their bouncy seats. She came back with 12 cans and actually smiled for the first time in weeks as she stacked them in the kitchen cabinet. Graduation came and went without any celebration since Mom couldn't leave the triplets, and I had to work right after the ceremony. Moving day arrived the following Saturday, and I loaded everything Hudson and I owned into my car while he played on the front lawn. The neighbor from 2 houses down saw me struggling with boxes and came over to help along with her teenage son, who carried the heavy stuff. Mom stood on the porch holding 2 of the triplets, while the third slept in the bassinet inside and watched us pack without saying much. When the car was full, she walked over and told me to drive safe and call when we got there, which was the nicest thing she'd said to me in years. Hudson waved goodbye from his car seat as we pulled away, and I watched Mom disappear in the rearview mirror, still holding those babies. The drive to campus took 40 minutes, and Hudson sang songs the whole way, while I tried not to cry about finally leaving that house. Our new apartment was on the 2nd floor of the student housing complex, with 2 small bedrooms and windows that actually opened. Hudson ran straight to his room and started putting his dinosaur toys on the shelves, while I unpacked our kitchen stuff. That first night, we ate mac and cheese on the floor since we didn't have a table yet, and Hudson fell asleep in his own room without any crying babies to wake him up. The next morning, I found the student-parent group meeting that Yasmin had told me about in the community center. There were 8 other parents there with kids ranging from babies to elementary school age, all dealing with the same stuff I was. They showed me how to sign up for free tutoring for Hudson and explained the emergency childcare swap system where we watched each other's kids during exams. One dad gave me his old coffee maker, and a mom handed me a bag of clothes her son had outgrown that would fit Hudson perfectly. Mom started texting me pictures of the triplets instead of the desperate messages asking for help she used to send. The babies were getting bigger, and she'd figured out how to prop bottles so she could feed 2 at once while holding the third. She mentioned the meal train was still bringing food 3 times a week, and Sean had found volunteers to help with laundry on Saturdays. After 2 weeks on campus, Hudson's new daycare teacher pulled me aside at pickup to say he was doing so much better than when he started. He'd made friends with 2 other boys and hadn't had a single tantrum since we moved, which was huge after months of him acting out at the old place. The teacher said he talked about his new room all the time and seemed really proud of living in an apartment like a big kid. I got hired at the campus library working 20 hours a week around my class schedule, which paid less than the grocery store, but let me study during slow times. My supervisor understood I was a single mom and never gave me grief when I had to leave right at 5 to get Hudson from daycare. The other student workers were nice, and one girl who was also a mom showed me which professors were understanding about kids getting sick. Mom and I worked out a routine where Hudson and I visited Sunday afternoons from 2 to 5 to help with the triplets. I'd give them baths while Mom prepped bottles for the week, and Hudson played with his toys in the living room away from the chaos. She never asked us to stay longer, and actually thanked me for coming when we left each week. The triplets hit 4 months old and were finally catching up to where they should be developmentally, even though they'd been born so early. They could hold their heads up and grab things, and even smiled sometimes when you talked to them. Mom had gotten better at managing all three at once, using the schedule from her online support group, and they actually napped at the same time most days. Cheyenne came by Mom's house one last time to close out the CPS case, since things had improved so much. She left the voluntary services open so Mom could keep going to parenting classes and therapy, which she actually wanted to continue. Cheyenne told me she was proud of how I'd set boundaries while still helping, and said most kids in my situation would have either abandoned their family completely or gotten sucked into being a full-time caregiver. Conrad called Mom in March to say his tax return came in bigger than expected, and he'd increase the child support by $200 a month starting immediately. Mom used the extra money to hire a college girl to help with the triplets for 10 hours every week. The helper came Tuesday and Thursday mornings, so Mom could shower without rushing and actually sleep for a couple hours. I saw the difference right away when we visited that Sunday, because Mom had washed her hair and changed out of the milk-stained shirt she'd been wearing for days. The triplets were 6 months old now and could sit up in their bouncy seats while Mom fed them rice cereal mixed with formula. Hudson helped by shaking rattles at them, which made them laugh and kept them happy during feeding time. Finals week came fast, and I studied every night after Hudson went to bed while highlighting my textbooks and making flashcards. The grades posted online 2 weeks later, and I'd made the dean's list with a 3.8 GPA my first semester of college. Hudson's daycare teacher showed me his progress report, and he'd moved up to the next classroom because he knew all his colors and could count to 20. We walked around campus together every afternoon, and he'd point out the squirrels and ask if we could bring them home to our apartment. Mom's letter came in the mail right before spring break, with 3 pages of neat handwriting on her good stationery. She wrote about how wrong she'd been to call me those names and treat me so badly when I needed support the most. She said she understood now what I went through because she was living it ×3 and wished she could take back every cruel word. The letter mentioned she'd started going to a different church across town that had a single mother's ministry and free nursery during service. I folded the letter and put it in my desk drawer because I wasn't ready to forgive everything yet, but at least she'd finally said sorry. The student parent group met every Wednesday night, and they voted me in as freshman representative, even though I'd only been there 1 semester. My job was to organize the emergency childcare for finals week, so parents could take their exams without worrying about their kids. I made spreadsheets with time slots and matched up parents who had different exam schedules to watch each other's children. Conrad's wife filed for divorce in April and moved back to her parents' house in another state with their teenage kids. He started calling Mom more often to check on the triplets and sent extra money for diapers without her having to ask. He even drove down 1 Saturday a month to learn how to change diapers and make bottles while Mom showed him the routine. The triplets recognized his voice after a few visits and would smile when he walked in, which made him try harder to be involved. Mom filled out all the paperwork for subsidized daycare and got approved to start when the triplets turned 8 months old. The daycare would only cost her $300 a month instead of $4,000, which meant she could go back to work part-time. She got hired at a clinic doing phone triage 3 days a week, which let her work while the babies were at daycare. December came, and Hudson and I decorated our tiny apartment tree with paper ornaments we made together. We baked sugar cookies in my little oven, and he helped by dumping in the flour and mixing with a wooden spoon. Christmas morning, he opened his presents from the student parent group toy drive and played with his new trucks on our living room rug. We drove to Mom's house for dinner, and the triplets were crawling everywhere in their matching Christmas onesies. Mom had cooked a real meal with ham and mashed potatoes and green beans like we used to have before everything fell apart. Hudson showed the triplets his new trucks, and they grabbed at them with their chubby hands while he laughed and pulled them away. Mom thanked me for coming and gave Hudson a present she'd wrapped herself, which turned out to be a set of books about dinosaurs. We stayed until 7 when the triplets started getting fussy for bed, and Hudson was yawning in the car on the way home. 6 months had passed since that awful day when Mom blocked my bedroom door with 3 screaming newborns. The triplets were healthy 8-month-olds who could crawl and babble and eat solid food without choking. Mom had her support system with the church, and the helper and Conrad actually showing up to do his part. Hudson was happy in our new life with his own room and friends at daycare, and a mom who could focus on him. I was actually succeeding in college and had found my place with other young parents who understood the struggle. We'd all found our footing even though the path to get here had been harder than anyone deserved. So yeah, that's how it all went down. Nothing fancy, just me telling it how it happened. Thanks for sticking around and hanging out. It honestly feels like chatting with a friend. Come back next time if you're in the mood.